сегодня у нас в гостях очень интересный лектор, один из ведущих специалистов в мире по творчеству Макинтоша, каталогами которого мы активно пользовались, когда готовили эту экспозицию, доктор Роджер Биллклифф. Он не только признанный эксперт, но также и автор 2 статей в нашем каталоге. Статьи, посвященные Макинтошу и Европе, и Макинтошу как художнику. И именно этот аспект творчества Макинтоша сегодня он затронет, наименее, я думаю, известный всем нам и обещающий нам всем наибольшее, наверное, эстетическое удовольствие. Пожалуйста, встречайте Роджера Биллклиффа.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I just wanted to say how impressive I think that this Mackintosh exhibition is. I've seen lots of exhibitions on the work of Charles Renni Mackintosh, and given the problems and the vicissitudes that accompanied the planning of this exhibition, which culminated in the terrible fire at Glasgow School of Art, I think that the museum and its publishers, its designers, its curators have made an excellent job of this show. Mackintosh never wrote very much about his philosophy of art. And so we have to guess about a lot of his intentions. And of course you can draw your own conclusions from the works themselves. But I just want to start with 2 aphorisms which Mackintosh did commit to posterity, one of which you'll see in the exhibition. There is hope in honest error, and none in the icy perfection of the mere stylist. And then in a lecture to fellow art workers, he said, "Art is the flower, life is the green leaf." Now, the first one of those was not Mackintosh's original words. He took it from a late Victorian arts and crafts architect called John Dando Sedding. But the second, from a later part of Mackintosh's life, could really be summed up as his main career statement. Here's Mackintosh at the age of 25, the young dandy, the young man about town, with his, floppy bow tie, his Armani unstructured jacket, his Zapata mustache, very much the bohemian young man. And yet he was an architect. And architects at this time dressed in tight suits and waistcoats and bow ties and very proper Victorian, late Victorian dress. Mackintosh was making a statement. In 1893, just as he was appointed senior draftsman in the firm of John Honeyman and Keppie. But this exhibition, this lecture, is about Mackintosh as a watercolorist, Mackintosh as an artist. Mackintosh considered that architecture was the consummate art, and that within a building, to make a building a work of art, to make it a total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk, as the Germans said, you had to preferably practice all of the arts. And Mackintosh was a carver. He modeled decorations for the School of Art. You'll see one of them, a photograph here of the panel over the doorway to the School of Art, which Mackintosh himself modeled in plaster, and it was then turned into stone with a pointing machine. He worked in beaten metal. He designed stained glass. He designed carved decoration, sculpture, for his buildings, but although he didn't make it himself. And he carefully considered the way that color could be used in his buildings. He started his artistic career, if you like, using watercolor as an architectural student. In the 1880s, as a trainee architect, he won prizes for the quality of his student notes, most of which were annotated with color. And he began to drive, or not drive, but be driven in a pony and trap and on trains or whatever, around Scotland, making drawings of traditional architectural forms. He was one of that generation of architects who believed that the classical and Gothic traditions were not for modern architecture. They represented 2 millennia ago, as far as classical was concerned, or 500 years ago, as far as Gothic was concerned. And although certain commissions he received forced him to use them, particularly Gothic, his own choice was for the architecture of the common people. Not necessarily the common people, but traditional architecture. Architecture which was designed to suit the place for which it was built. So in Scotland, it means you have sloping roofs with slates to throw off the rain. You have strong eaves which keep the water off the walls. You cover the walls with harling, which protects the stone or the brick underneath from the wind and the rain. And he looked, therefore, at buildings which over the centuries had been designed to combat anything that the Scottish climate could throw at them. I'm not showing you a particularly good example of that, because this is Mackintosh looking at an old tomb in Elgin, as he says, painted when he was about 20 on one of his tours of the north of Scotland. But he's admiring the craftsmanship of this classical tomb, and he admires it enough to not make a pencil drawing of it, but to make a watercolor, to make one of his first paintings. And for 2 or 3 years, he produced several watercolors like this. Then in 1890, he won a competition at Glasgow School of Art for a scholarship, a travelling scholarship, where he won £60, which I suppose today would be the equivalent of about £2,500. I'm not sure what that is in rubles, which allowed him to spend 3 months travelling in Italy. And his attitude towards painting, towards watercolour, changed very much on that tour. Most of the work he produced, and there are probably about 300 drawings that survive, were pencil drawings, or pencil drawings annotated with little bits of watercolour, looking at details of buildings, which he would take back. Before the days of pocket cameras, he made his drawings. He documented his visit by making drawings. But at the same time, he began to make pictorial studies of what he was looking at. Items chosen for their pictorial effect. This particular view here of the tower, of the monastery in Monreale, seen through, very sensitive, seen through the arch of the cloisters. Here, a view of the font in the baptistry. And although Mackintosh could use these watercolours as aide-memoire in later work, they were basically pictures. They were paintings. They could be submitted to exhibitions and exist in their own right as works of art. Here's another one of the cathedral at Oviedo. Mackintosh was fascinated by the banding of the different colours of stone used in the cathedral. And something that you think would make a much better black and white drawing, he has turned into a colour painting, a watercolour painting. He exhibited these pictures when he came back to Glasgow in an exhibition, not in the formal School of Art, but in a student society called the Glasgow School of Art Club. And they were visited by the external examiners for the art school. And one of them, who was probably one of the leading artists in Scotland at that time, turned to the headmaster and said, "This man is wasted as an architect. He should be training to become a painter." I'm sure that was passed on to Mackintosh, but he chose not to turn away from his training as an architect. which by this time, he spent 10 years, more or less, or 8 years at the School of Art as a part-time student, studying in the evenings and the early mornings while working in an architectural office. But by the early 1890s, when these were doing, he was taking part in classes of painting and drawing as part of the architectural syllabus. Excuse me. So Mackintosh decided to carry on as an artist. As an artist in his spare time, but it was still a very important part of his life. At the School of Art Club, something else very important happened to him. He met the girl who was later to become his wife, Margaret MacDonald, whose sister Frances MacDonald was also at the art school, and they were training as part of the general fine art course, which included painting and drawing, included modeling, graphic design, product design, and so on. And shortly after meeting them, Mackintosh produced his first imaginative watercolor. It's not anything to do with buildings, it's nothing to do with architecture. It was made as a present for his friend and employer, John Keppie, because the previous year Keppie had given him another drawing, another watercolor, and Mackintosh was returning the gift. Keppie's watercolor was of a building, a church in Ely. Mackintosh chose, as I say, an imaginative subject. It's called the Harvest Moon, and there's the autumn moon low on the horizon, against which is silhouetted this figure of an angel or a fairy, depending on whether you're religious or not. And the figure is standing on a cloud. But inside that cloud is another figure, a horizontal study of a nude woman floating along as a cloud above this foreground thicket of blackberries and whortleberries, which are, it is said, a symbol of the clan Mackintosh. So here's a picture which exists on several levels. It's a present to his boss. It's a study of clan symbols. It's a study of a particular feature of the Scottish autumn seasons, the low moon, which was particularly prevalent during the harvest months of late August and September. And it introduces an unexplained symbol of the angel silhouetted against this big circle with her wings encircling the moon itself. We still don't know what it means. Does it mean anything? Is it just a student game? Is it something that Mackintosh was sharing, not with John Keppie, who was a rather upright, stuffy architect, typical of the Glasgow profession at that time? Or is it a joke or an intimate story shared only with his friends, the MacDonald sisters? Because about the same time, Margaret and Frances MacDonald began to make a series of watercolors which are similarly impenetrable. The one on the left is called Summer, and it seems to be a design for a stained glass window. It's got the same kind of vegetation that Mackintosh has had, but this time it's much more stylized. These pods, they're almost like peas here, out of which shoots are growing. But here's a couple doing things which no Victorian couple would ever do in public, and that's a very lewd or lascivious kiss that's happening between these two figures. There is a drawing, a similar drawing by Herbert McNair, who was the fourth member of this group, which shows a couple copulating, which again was almost, it wasn't just unheard of, it just did not happen in public art in Victorian times. Now, is it a personal language? These two sisters married eventually, Herbert McNair and Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Are they just sending each other messengers? Are they having fun? Are they delighting in confusing the public? Whatever they are doing, they are inventing a language which was unlike anything else which was seen in Britain and, or even in much of Europe at this time of 1893. They share common features. Here are the doves or the crows or whatever they are flying across in a horizontal line. Here they appear in Francis MacDonald's picture, which is titled The Girl in the East Wind or Ill Omen. Now, it oozes malevolence in a way. The colours, the blues and the greens, the sort of still stance. In fact, is she standing or is she hovering? Does she have wings? Are these wing cases here attached to her back? The ravens are flying across her. She's silhouetted like Mackintosh's harvest moon against another moon. And here is the same circle. Is it a circle of life? Is it a circle of death? Or is it just a student joke? There were about a dozen of these students who together put together a handwritten magazine. And it contained poetry, it contained short stories. There was only one copy, and it was circulated amongst everybody. And the sisters, and Mackintosh and McNair, put paintings into the magazine. They had titles like The Shadow. And here's another one of these grotesque plant forms growing out of a pod or a comb at the bottom with stems which branch into smaller branches and then so on into a flower at the top, casting a shadow. But the shadow doesn't match the plant. On the right, Descent of Night. And here again is the angel that we saw from the harvest moon, but this time it's a man, I think. No, it's not. This one's a woman, I beg your pardon. And she's stretching out her arms against her wings, and the birds this time are flying towards the viewer. It has this same rather evil, menacing choice of colours, of purples and blues and greens. And this time the sun has sunk below the horizon, and the figure seems to be standing on it. It's Descent of Night. So at least that bit of it is understandable. The sun is descending below the horizon. But who is this figure? What does she represent? What are the birds doing? They're flying below the ground, apparently, not even below, well below the horizon. Does it have a particular message to the viewer, or is the message only intended for that small group of people who were party to the code, which would explain what all of these watercolours were about? But they're not architectural. Mackintosh has moved away. As a young draftsman, he's still making buildings. He's still making huge buildings. Glasgow Herald Building, Queen Margaret Medical College. All of these buildings are happening at the same time as he's producing these little watercolours. But he's only doing 4 or 5 a year. They are things he's doing in his spare time. He's not sending them to exhibiting societies. He's simply showing them to his friends. But occasionally, he puts them on show with the rest of the artists, who were called the Four, in School of Art Club exhibitions. And the public were invited in, and the press, just as the press chose Impressionism to denigrate the French painters of the early 1870s, they called these painters the Spook School, spook being a sort of slang term for ghosts. 2 of the later pictures in the magazine are these two, the tree of personal effort and the tree of influence. They're interesting in that Mackintosh decides that he has to give them a title. They're so impenetrable that he has to give them a title. But the titles don't mean anything to us. Yes, the tree of personal effort. Well, we know about the tree of knowledge, so why can't you have a tree of personal effort? Why can't you have a tree of influence? But nobody else uses this imagery. Nowhere else does this phrase appear either in literature or in poetry. It's something which Mackintosh has invented, just as he's invented the imagery here. Again, a huge circle. Is it the sun or is it the moon? Plants growing with roots below the ground, tall stems or tree trunks, and the blossom up at the top. On the right-hand side, the tree of influence. And here you can, if you have a mind, interpret it as a diagram of the female reproductive organs. And again, we go back to the sexual imagery of these four young people. Frances MacDonald was barely 20. She had lived a fairly sheltered life. Her sister, Margaret MacDonald, was 8 years older, but still unmarried, still a spinster. And you would not expect in late Victorian England for them, or even Mackintosh, to have this kind of knowledge of human anatomy. Legs and arms and breasts and heads, yes, but what's inside you is something which was totally alien to British painting at the time. Mackintosh in 1895 had just designed the first women's medical college in Britain, in Glasgow, and he's recorded as spending his time looking down the microscopes at the strange things that all of these students studied, amoeba, spermatozoa. And the spermatozoa is a motif which Mackintosh came back to almost throughout the rest of his life, certainly through the next 20 years. So Mackintosh had some of this knowledge, and he used it in his personal private paintings. But the Spook School didn't last long. Nobody bought them. And it's not surprising that no one bought them, because people were offended by them, people were frightened by them. And gradually, they turned towards more romantic subjects, particularly the girls. All of the watercolors that we've looked at so far are that big. They are very small. This is much bigger, it's about this wide. It is an exhibition painting, A Girl with Blue Butterflies. It's a descriptive title. It's a title because there's a girl with white butterflies and there's a girl with red butterflies and so on. So it's a title which has been given to it by our generation. We don't know what Frances called it, but it's like the traditional views of Ophelia floating in the water, spurned by Hamlet, surrounded by flowers, surrounded by bluebells, and of course by blue butterflies. But it's a much softer, it's a much more approachable piece of work, and it grows out of pre-Raphaelite imagery and so on. Mackintosh produced his own variations of it. And what all of these paintings have in common is that the figures have no feet. They have no legs. They have heads and necks. Occasionally they have arms. Very rarely do they have hands. And the next time you see that kind of composition is in the paintings of Gustav Klimt. And there is no doubt that Klimt knew these paintings. He saw them in Vienna in 1900 when Mackintosh and the four exhibited in the Vienna Secession. I don't think there are any paintings of figures like this in great robes and hiding all of their anatomy other than their heads before Klimt saw these paintings. So they had an enormous effect on one of the most sort of iconic painters of the early 20th century. But again, the subjects are much softer. There is none of the sense of evil, the sense of malevolence, that there was in the early student work. And I mean, they are figures surrounded by roses, which became so much a Glasgow motif. And here in fairyland, surrounded by wildflowers, by poppies and flag irises and so on. Still, in this picture, the same sort of palette, but with a much greater sense of prettiness to them. Now, Mackintosh, as I say, was producing 4 or 5 watercolors a year at this time. By 1897, they more or less stopped, because he had been given the commission, or he had won the commission, or his firm had won the commission to design the Glasgow School of Art. And from being an architect who was a draftsman who started work at 8 o'clock in the morning and he went home at 5 o'clock at night, he suddenly takes on the mantle of the chief designer in the office of Honeyman and Keppie. And what suffers is his artistic output. And there are very few paintings like that. This is the last of them for 10 years. And it's one of the pictures he made on his tours around England, looking at vernacular architecture. And most of the time, he made drawings. Mackintosh was not a literary person. He couldn't write about his thoughts. But you put a pencil in his hand, and he will draw it. And Clay said that drawing was like letting a pencil go for a walk. Mackintosh felt exactly the same. And if you look at the sketchbooks, he takes that aphorism, there is hope in honest error. If he makes a mistake, he doesn't cross it out. He draws on top of it. And what he draws on top of it becomes an abstract composition. So instead of a drawing of a capital in a church nave or a piece of furniture, you get an abstract pattern where all of the mistakes are incorporated within the design. But here, Mackintosh is being literal again, as a tourist, without a camera, but with a box of paints. And it's the sort of building that he would draw in Scotland, the sort of building which had a great influence on his later work as a domestic architecture and designer. Drawing for the next 10 or 15 years became relegated to holidays. In 1900, he married Margaret MacDonald, and they went on honeymoon, apparently, to Holy Island, which is an island just off the coast of Northumbria, which is cut off by the tide. The tide comes in, goes out, and you can walk onto the island. It comes in, and it's cut off. So it's a very romantic, rather spooky place, because everything depends on, do I have to go to the mainland? No, the tide's coming, you can't do it. These days with 4x4s, you can go any time of the day you like, but not in 1900. Mackintosh was fascinated by the castle, which was a domestic house by this time, and he drew it from several different viewpoints. It was owned by a man who published a very influential magazine called Country Life. And Country Life's favorite architect was a contemporary of Mackintosh called Edwin Lutyens. And Lutyens knew Mackintosh's work, came to Glasgow, saw it, admired it, and worried about it. He saw this. He saw this stenciled panel, and you can see here the same figures without feet used in the stenciled panel. These figures were 3 meters high in the Buchanan Street tea rooms. So Lutyens knew this, and he found it rather difficult to understand, but he enjoyed the use of color and the sense of design. Mackintosh knew about Lutyens' arts and crafts work. Whether he knew that Lutyens was working here, we don't know. But the Mackintoshes went to Holy Island for 2 or 3 years on their summer holidays, and Mackintosh drew the castle regularly. He made these 2 watercolors not as paintings. They are watercolors, small watercolors, which were used to put into an exhibition in Turin to show the two big panels which he and Margaret had made for the Ingram Street tea rooms, and which had been shown in Vienna, and which again had an enormous influence on Klimt and Joseph Hoffmann, who copied the idea of this panel, which would be 3 meters up in the air. It's a meter 50 high. It was 3 meters up in the air, encircling the room. Klimt and Hoffmann used the same idea in an exhibition interior in the Vienna Secession in 1902 or 1903. But here's Mackintosh making the first of the gesso panels for the tea rooms at Ingram Street in 1900. And there's Mackintosh's version, and here's Margaret's. The only trouble is that although that is signed by Margaret, it was actually drawn by Mackintosh. And it sets part of the problem that we have with placing the contribution which Margaret made to Mackintosh's interiors. And we know that Mackintosh is making these studies to send somewhere else, but why didn't Margaret make her own? Why did Mackintosh make it on her behalf? Was it because he'd made the original idea and because it was easier for him to put it together than it was for Margaret? Was she busy on something else? We don't know. But it shows how those tiny watercolors from the 1890s are suddenly transformed into gesso panels which are 5 meters wide and 1.5 meters high. So the rest of the period from about 1898 to 1914, Mackintosh only paints on holiday. But he makes the occasional study, and this one's in the exhibition here, which he made as a present for the daughter of the Glasgow School of Art. And he's stylizing flowers. By this time, he was beginning to make analytical drawings of flowers. But here he's making a painting as a present. And so they are stylized images, recognizable, but not set in a naturalistic context. They're not shown in a room setting. They are shown as a pattern, almost as a textile design. Occasionally, he would look at a subject which he would normally draw and make a painting of it. And here, well, a drawing, an elaborate drawing. Here, he's looking at Newton Castle in Blairgowrie in 1909, and he's turning what would normally be a simple line drawing, as we saw at Holy Island, into a much more pictorial structure. But it's very flat. It's like an architect's elevation. He's only presenting it as a series of abstract shapes overlapping. Even this yew tree here in the foreground and this bush here and here are presented as ghostly abstract shapes imposed upon the architectural structure of the building behind. 1909 was the year that Mackintosh completed the Glasgow School of Art. And after that, he had very few serious commissions in Glasgow. There was a recession in Glasgow. There was not a lot of work for any architects, and even less for some architect who was as known to be difficult, should we say, at times, but also someone who had a particularly personal and idiosyncratic point of view. At the same time, when he finished the School of Art, whose Western elevation we now consider to be one of the great landmarks of 20th century architecture, the architectural students who inhabited it thought it was old-fashioned. They were learning, they were 20 years younger than the Mackintosh who had designed it originally. And they saw it as something which did not point to the future. In many ways, they were right, because the future of architecture in Glasgow, in Britain as a whole, turned towards a neoclassical revival and away from the Art Nouveau, or the English-Scottish vernacular that Mackintosh was proposing. So Mackintosh dissolved his partnership with John Keppie, and he left to go on holiday to the south of England. Now, this is Mackintosh in 1919, but he looked just like that in 1914 when he left Glasgow. Now, that is, 20 years after the photograph we saw at the beginning. And you can see how Mackintosh, the problems of running a business, of making a living, of fighting his opponents within Glasgow, within Scotland, has told a tale on Mackintosh's life. And it shows in this photograph, he's gained weight, he's lost hair, he's lost all of that vibrant bohemian outlook that the young man had of 25. And here's Mackintosh at 45, looking a very different character indeed. He went to Walberswick to recuperate from the trials of working in Glasgow. And he was trapped there. He went in the spring of 1914. He was trapped by the outbreak of war in August 1914. There was an immediate ban on new building, so there was no chance of him making a career as an architect. He was in a very sort of cut-off part of the country in Suffolk, working and living in Walberswick. But he turned to the kind of painting which he'd begun to do around 1910, which was these analytical drawings of flowers. And many of them are made from pressing flowers or putting them in a book. But he's interested in the shapes that they make. And although they are reckoned by botanists to be very good examples of showing the structure of a flower, he's drawing them as decorative exercises, really. And in 1915-14, he starts a series of about 50 of them, which it is believed he was given a commission from Austria to produce these by a friend or a patron in Austria or Germany, probably realizing that he was suffering hard times. And he was given a commission, apparently, to make a book of architectural, of botanical sketches, which meant that he was sending letters backwards and forwards between Britain and Germany. And this apparently still happened during the First World War. Although there was a military conflict, social life still happened, and there were lots of connections between the country on a business and on a social level. The local police intercepted these letters and considered Mackintosh to be a potential spy. And they didn't understand his Glasgow accent, which they thought was indicative of the man being a foreigner. And foreigners, Walberswick was on a part of the English coast which was considered to be very susceptible to a German invasion. So he was imprisoned in the local jail, and eventually he was released, but he was told that he should leave the port and settle in London. If he really was a spy, he could have done far more damage in London than he could ever have done in Walberswick. But you can see the sort of, he's interested in structure. He's interested in how these plants grow and what happens to them. In very many of these drawings, you'll see 3 or 4 different stages of the life of the flower. They're not necessarily one flower. He's putting different ones together, so you'll see it in bud, you'll see it in full flower, and you'll see it as the petals drop off, and you get the skeletal shape of the flower, as in the one on the right of Heartsease. But he realized that botanical drawings were not going to give him a living. He still received some income from the former practice in Glasgow, and his wife had some little money as a private income from her family. And so he started to make watercolours which he could send to exhibiting societies like the Royal Academy, like the New English Art Club, the Watercolour Society, and so on, in the hopes of selling them. And he priced them at £15 or 15 guineas, at £20, £25, which was not a lot of money by any means. And he didn't sell a single one. And later, perhaps, but not these first drawings of Walberswick. And he's looking at the port. And he's having a little trouble with perspective. And you'll see it in a watercolour of a southern port, a study of Port Vendres, in the exhibition, where the left-hand side has got a different sense of perspective from the right-hand side. And he's struggling to make the proper connection. But others are simpler. Others are what you might expect of an architect, making elevations. And it's the first of the watercolours where Mackintosh begins to flatten the perspective, and he does it deliberately. And he may have done it because he couldn't help it. There has been a suggestion that he suffered from a problem with his left eye. As a child, he had rheumatic fever, and he came out of the illness with a drooping eyelid. And as he got older, stressed, more tired, the eyelid would drop and eventually close this eye. And it's been suggested that he saw these buildings and landscapes about this time with only one eye. So there was no stereoscopic vision. So there was no real sense of depth. And he may have been aware of it. He may have decided to make the most of it and to emphasize it. And he began here, in a minor way, to show the landscape and the different in distance in as much detail as the events in the foreground. I mean, this church and the clump of trees here is drawn as carefully as the reflections in the water. I'll get it. In the water here in the foreground. But he's attracted by the local architecture, the vernacular architecture. But nobody lives here. There are no figures. It's almost like early landscape photography or early urban photography, where the exposures were so long that people had walked out of the exposure of the photograph, and so that people walking down the street didn't register. Mackintosh ignored people walking down the street. This was a busy warehouse, but Mackintosh doesn't show anyone using it, walking past it, coming to it. And you could say it was because he took a long time to do it. These watercolors would take him 2, 3, 4 weeks, and perhaps he decided that the moment for someone walking in and out was gone, and so he didn't do it. You could also say, as it's been said, that they show that Mackintosh is not putting any real emotion, is not putting any real sense of humanity into the paintings. When he moved to London, he and his wife decided to enter the annual exhibition, or the triannual exhibition of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society. And they sent in an exhibit of which we know very little, but it supposedly had 12 panels and candlesticks, and it was called Voices in the Wood. And the only 2 pictures which fit the bill of surviving from this period were actually painted in oil. And again, they're very large. They're about 1.20 meters high and about 3 meters wide. And they're interesting in that all of these elements in the background, these shields here, these patterns of roses and the vegetation and so on, and this decoration here, this swirling decoration, all come from ideas which Mackintosh had for textile designs, which he produced from about 1916 to 1922. And he was very prolific. There are about 200 surviving, and quite a lot of which were bought by textile manufacturers. But they show Mackintosh reinventing his architectural decorative style of wanting to have abstract patterns which were repetitive for furnishing fabrics, for curtains, for upholstery, and so on. And we'll see them in later watercolours too. And then there are two of these figures who only have heads and suggested bodies and no legs, arms or feet, meeting in the centre. And this painting, I think, is one of the sad losses from the Glasgow School of Art fire. Landscapes of Walberswick didn't work, so Mackintosh decided that botanical studies weren't going to sell, so perhaps studies of cut flowers in a room setting, bouquets of flowers might have more success in the exhibition societies. And he began to produce elaborate and absolutely beautiful studies of flowers, like this one of anemones, which is one of the first. And in the back, reflected in a mirror, is a hanging made from one of his textile designs. And you can see that, again, he's playing games, the abstraction of the textile with the ambiguity of the space behind in the mirror, and then the vase and its flowers set on the table. People say, well, you know, Mackintosh is not sort of, he's not the stature of Picasso and, you know, one of the artists who invented Cubism, but he's perfectly aware of Cubism. He knows what's happening. He tilts the table top up towards the viewer. It creates an artificial horizon. He's silhouetting his vase against it. There's no real chiaroscuro, there's no shade on this to indicate that it's a circular vase. It's presented as a flat piece of striped design in front of us. But the flowers are realistic. But gradually they become more stylized. Here in begonias, Mackintosh again presents the vase flat, facing the viewer on the table, no shading of it at all. The design of the painting is about these three blooms. And you can see those three blooms in stencils. There's one of them. I mean, from 20 years, exactly 20 years earlier. This is 1896, and that is 1916. And in the background is another of his abstract textile designs. So he's a man who is experimenting all the time. And he's failing desperately to make a living from it. One of my favorites, peonies. Peonies are incredibly difficult to paint. And he's not tried to set it in a naturalistic setting at all. He simply hung one of his most abstract Art Deco type fabrics of 1919 or so, 5 years before the term Art Deco was invented, and put his simple vase on a tabletop and these beautiful blooms. Orange is one of the most difficult colors for painters to handle. It clashes and kills everything that's put anywhere near it. And yet Mackintosh has made it work here. The orange is working for him, and he's making sure that it's working to his advantage. White roses, more Glasgow roses, more abstract textile designs. In 1920, Mackintosh and Margaret went on holiday again, left London, and went to visit a village called Worth-Matravers. And Mackintosh made 2 watercolours there. This one showing the shape of the village, how the village had grown up the hillside. We're standing here just outside the village, and we're led into it by the lane which goes up to the church and the other houses beyond. And those houses beyond are painted in as much detail as the houses here. The only reason that we know they're further away is they're painted smaller. But you can see as much detail there as you can here. And this is a village, but nobody lives there. It's almost a ghost town. And again, is it caused by a Mackintosh feeling that he couldn't, in a scene which had taken him several weeks to record, he didn't want to record the life of the village. And then he turned away from the village towards the sea. And he produced one of the most extraordinary compositions by putting this telegraph pole in the middle of his composition, this utterly alien, man-made element inside the natural. Okay, there are walls here and there's a little house, but this painting is about the landscape. It's about the shapes of the ploughed fields and the hay fields and the pond in the foreground. But it's dominated by an architectural, one of the crudest architectural features you can ever imagine. It's not even an architectural piece, it's a piece of building, it's a piece of technology. And yet, Mackintosh was fascinated by it. The flower pictures continued throughout the 1920s. He sent them to Paris, he sent them to Detroit, Chicago, New York. He sold one. Someone in Detroit bought one of them. But so Mackintosh had a very dispiriting life in London. He was employed to work on one interior decorative scheme in Derngate, in Northampton. He made designs for a theatre, for a block of flats, for a block of studios, none of which ever happened. And at the end of 1922, beginning of 1923, he was persuaded by a friend, a painter called J.D. Ferguson, a Glaswegian, lived in Glasgow ultimately, whom Mackintosh had met while he was in London. All of these I'm showing you they're all very similar. They're all very stylized pictures, all with decorative backgrounds. But he's speaking and discussing his problem with Ferguson and Ferguson's wife, Margaret Morris. The Fergusons told him, well, we spend 6 months of every year in France because it is so cheap. And you can live in France for a month, if not 2 months, for what it costs you to live in London for a week. So the Mackintoshes closed their studios in London and they traveled to the southernmost point of France, to the Eastern Pyrenees, the Pyrénées Orientales, and settled first of all in Collioure at the side of the Mediterranean. And there Mackintosh made a study of 3 of the buildings, the townscape in the town, which now is the height of the sort of French society. Artists from all over the world go to Collioure. When Mackintosh went, there was nobody there. There were a couple of Englishmen there, friends of his from London, but very few other artists. And Mackintosh set up his easel across the water from the summer palace of the Queens of Aragon. He's fascinated by it because it looks like the south elevation of the Glasgow School of Art. It looks like Windy Hill and the Hill House. And it's set against this backdrop of the foothills of the Pyrenees. And again, Mackintosh draws them in as much detail, creating a pattern, just like he'd created with his textile designs, above the simple structure in the foreground. And that set a tradition for him almost of what he would do for the next 4 or 5 years. This is one of the few watercolours that's got somebody living in it. It's a group of Frenchmen playing cards and drinking a bottle of wine outside the local cafe. And Mackintosh has emphasized the closeness of the mountains behind. In fact, they rise so high that you don't even see the sky. And they're just a pattern. They're a horizontal striated pattern contrasting with the architectural shapes of the streets in the foreground. Collioure, where this was painted, became too hot for the Mackintoshes. And they moved into the upper towns in the Pyrenees for the summers because it was cooler. And then in the winter, they would come back down to the coast where it was warmer and where the sun shone more. And so you have this constant moving backwards and forwards. And I started to work on these watercolours in 20, 30 years ago for an exhibition in Glasgow. And there we had 50 watercolours. And the 50 is important because Mackintosh went to France with the promise of an exhibition from a London gallery, the Leicester Galleries, that if he came back with 50 watercolours, they'd give him an exhibition. So there was a point to it. He never tried to sell them. He was keeping them together for an exhibition, which sadly never happened. But it was only one of them is dated 1927. And to work out when they were painted, because there's hardly anything mentioned in letters between Mackintosh and Margaret, is impossible, or how it was done and so on. And then I sat down with a map to try and plot where he had been. And everywhere is within 100 yards of a railway line. And there is a little train that runs through the Pyrenees from Perpignan right up to Montlouis, called Le Train Jaune, the yellow train. And it was the only way to travel from the coast up into the mountains before roads and cars became much better. And so you can plot how Mackintosh went. You know, that he would get off at each station and set up his easel, find a hotel for a week, and produce his paintings. Here's a farm, Blanc-Comtois. He was fascinated by these big farms. They're called mares in this part of France. They're like the Hill House, and they're like Windy Hill in their arrangements. And he sets them against stylized skies, which again remind us of some of his textile designs. A hill town in southern France, and the road up to the hill leads us into the village. Beautiful color. And these are all about 50 by 50 centimeters. Palalda. And this shows that Mackintosh was cheating. He was choosing subjects which mattered to him. It wasn't a random choice of a village. This painting, this section here, is a cutout from this part of the village, from a different viewpoint. And he decided that he preferred the foothills of that part of the village to the ones which were actually here. So he moved his easel round the corner, painted the foothills, cut them out, pasted on top of the drawing that he had already made. So they are not what you see is what you get. They are very much about Mackintosh making a quite specific judgment. The buzzing is my phone, so please ignore it. It will stop. Simple view of slate roofs, looking at the rocks, the remains of a quarry in the foreground from which all of these sort of houses are made. And Mackintosh is often contrasting the natural outcrops of rock with what human beings have done with them. One of my favorites, a very simple, very, very bright painting called Summer in the South. Lovely painting, great color. Not the oppressive, rather frightening color that we saw in the 1890s, but a much more naturalistic color. A simple view of the landscape. No houses, no sign of man's involvement with the landscape at all. And another one which contrasts the foreground of the houses. It's got a cart here and it's got some animals in the barn, but no human beings, with the road snaking its way through the landscape to the sort of outcrop of rock, the unman-made landscape, from which this part of the landscape was actually made. In his final year in the south of France, Mackintosh settled in Port-Vendres. Margaret had to return to England because she was not well and she had to go to London for some medical treatment. And she settled Mackintosh in Port-Vendres, in the Hôtel du Commerce, the cheapest hotel in the town. And she wrote to him every day, and he wrote to her once a week. And her side of the correspondence has disappeared. Mackintosh didn't keep it. She kept his letters, and they are a series of about 20 letters or so, which give us some insight into the way he lived. Mackintosh is often sort of characterized as a failure because he drank. And perhaps he did. But Scotland was a drinking culture, and it still is a drinking culture. I used to say to the School of Art, director of the School of Art, surely Mackintosh couldn't have been alcoholic. Look at the detail that you see in his architectural drawings and in his flower drawings. And this guy, Harry Barnes, who had been at the art school and whose parents-in-law had been friends of Mackintosh, he turned and said to me, he said, my deputy is one of the world's greatest wood engravers. And until he's had 3 glasses of whiskey, his hand doesn't stop shaking. And perhaps Mackintosh was like that. But in these letters, he says to Margaret, I opened a bottle of wine last night. I had a glass, kept it for lunch. There'll be something left for tonight. And whether he's consciously making the point that he's no longer drinking or he's controlling his drinking, we don't know. But ominously, he also complains to her about the quality of the tobacco that he's smoking. And he says, the American tobacco is the worst, the French tobacco is not much better, and so on. And at the end of this summer, he returned to England with problems which had been caused or exacerbated by the amount of tobacco he was using. So he spent the summer from about April through to the end of August, working in Port-Vendres, spending 4 or 5 weeks on these watercolors, working on 2 or 3 at a time, because he needed to go back when the light was the same for everyone. So if he started this picture in the morning, he couldn't work on it in the afternoon because the light had changed, the shadows had changed, and so on. So in the afternoon, he would work on a different subject. And he kept juggling all of these watercolors. Port-Vendres is surrounded by Napoleonic forts, and Mackintosh was obviously fascinated by them and by the lighthouses. And this last series of his pictures concentrate on them and on the life of the port. It's a busy port, one of the busiest in the south of France, but nobody seems to live there. And he looked at it from all its different viewpoints, using the sort of the townscape to create. And you know, there's something about this. This looks like a cropped photograph. That you know, you take your holiday snaps and you decide, well, if you cropped it, it's going to look so much better composition. And it's almost as if Mackintosh has seen a postcard, a holiday postcard of this village, and decided that he would work from the same viewpoint. The way that these steps are foreshortened in the foreground is not a natural point of view for an artist. Reflections in the water became very important to him. And again, you go back to the abstraction here of the reflections in the water and the abstraction of the patterns that he's creating. And he is creating patterns. He's taking something that's in front of him and making abstract shapes from it. One of the big forts to the south of the town. You see Port-Vendres in the background and the harbour here, and this gully between the fort defending the town. It's almost the School of Art. And this is the last picture that he was working on in Port Vendre, and he writes to Margaret, I'm going back to the rock today, you know, it's giving me a lot of problems. I can't get it right. There's too much green in the picture. And there's hardly any green in the picture, but obviously he was using green to create the greys and blacks of these rocks. Now, these rocks are nothing like as statuesque and monumental as this. They are tiny rocks. They're no bigger than a man. But Mackintosh has chosen to sit above them and to exaggerate their impact on the landscape. He's making a monumental subject out of a fairly simple naturalistic subject. Margaret came back to Port Vendre after her treatment in London and decided that Mackintosh should return to London to undergo treatment for the problems he was suffering with his mouth. And he returned to London and was diagnosed with cancer of the tongue. And there's no doubt that the tobacco he chewed and smoked had played a considerable part in the development of the cancer. And the treatment at the time was for the removal of his tongue. And he spent a year convalescing after the operation. And his friend, Margaret Morris, the wife of J.D. Ferguson, who was a dancer and ran a drama school, tried to teach him to talk again. But as most people with cancer of the tongue, he died after a year in 1928. It's an unnecessary comment in a way, but on his death, the value of his estate was placed at £86. That watercolour sold for £200,000 20 years ago. And its monetary value should not be a reflection of artistic value, but it does show how our attitude towards Mackintosh in the latter part of his life has changed, and how what had been in 1978 almost unrecognized is now seen as a particularly productive part of his life. Thank you.